The Capitol dome gleams under the Washington sun, a monument to the power of the purse. The national debt clock spins violently nearby, a blur of red numbers tracking every publicly debated dime. Then, the system goes dark. A single transaction hits the ledger. In 2020, the United States Treasury spent $500 billion. Congress never held a hearing. They never cast a vote. It is a paper trail that officially does not exist. You check the price of groceries, watch the inflation data, and argue over tax brackets. That is the public ledger, the grand distraction designed to keep your attention on the pennies. While you balance your household budget, the true purchasing power of your money is being diluted by an unaccountable slush fund. By ignoring this mechanism, you are functioning as the unwitting financier of a shadow economic empire. I'm going to hand you the forensic tools to track this invisible money. We're going to bypass the official economic narrative and decode the Exchange Stabilization Fund. You will gain the optics of an elite financial investigator tracking capital flights and offshore maneuvers to see the actual matrix of global power. The corpse is a broken democratic system, and we're going to find the transaction that killed it. The air in the National Archives' secure review room smells of dry paper and institutional silence. The forensic accountant slides a yellowed document from a dusty box. It is the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The typewritten ink looks fragile, almost harmless. But hovering over the investigator's shoulder is the cold glare of a Bloomberg terminal, mapping billions in active, untraceable assets originating from this exact piece of paper. The accountant runs a finger down the brittle page, tracing the origin of the anomaly. In 1934, the United States government committed an unprecedented act of financial force. They confiscated privately held gold from every citizen, and then artificially revalued it overnight. This single, sweeping move generated a sudden, unearned profit of $2.8 billion. $2.8 billion in the middle of the Great Depression was a staggering sum, a mountain of capital suddenly sitting completely off the books. It was the ultimate slush fund, materialized out of thin air through an executive mandate. This phantom wealth became the seed capital for something completely new. It created the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a financial weapon hidden in plain sight. The accountant cross-references the historical text with the flashing green data on the terminal. The architecture of the crime comes into focus. This fund granted the Treasury Secretary unilateral power to stabilize the value of the dollar on the global stage. It meant the executive branch could deploy massive amounts of capital without ever walking across the street to ask Congress for a single dime. In any functioning republic, the legislature holds the purse strings specifically to prevent tyranny. But this fund severed that fundamental democratic link. By utilizing off-balance sheet operations, the Treasury built a parallel financial universe. They established a closed ecosystem where massive macroeconomic interventions could be executed in absolute silence, far away from the messy reality of public oversight. The investigator zeroes in on Section 10 of the Act. The legal phrasing is a masterpiece of bureaucratic immunity. It explicitly states that the decisions of the Secretary are final, not subject to debate, not subject to a vote. The text mandates that these financial maneuvers may not be reviewed by any other officer of the United States. It is a legally binding invisibility cloak. Read that clause again through the lens of a forensic audit. It means the Inspector General is locked out. It means the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over the ledger. The creators of this fund did not just build a financial reserve. They engineered an impenetrable black box at the very core of the American government. What began as a Depression-era maneuver to manage gold reserves did not quietly expire when the crisis ended. It mutated. The accountant watches the Bloomberg ticker update in real time, tracking the descendants of those original $2.8 billion. The ledger now commands resources capable of rewriting the global economic order in an afternoon, entirely free from the constraints of democratic law. We are looking at a systemic anomaly that defies every rule of modern governance. A single paragraph, drafted nearly a century ago, stripped the American public of their financial sovereignty and handed it to an unelected few. This is not a glitch in the financial system. It is the core operating system working exactly as designed, draining accountability with every transaction. To understand how trillions of dollars can move through the modern world without leaving a public trace, we have to recognize the true nature of this 90-year-old law. The investigator logs out of the terminal, the screen going dark, leaving only the reflection of a broken system. We are staring directly at the ultimate financial alibi. This is the original sin of American finance. That legally binding invisibility cloak did not just sit in an archive gathering dust. The absolute immunity granted in 1934 became a loaded weapon, waiting for the right crisis to be fired. I tracked the deployment of this financial arsenal to a dimly lit hotel lobby bar in Geneva. A former Treasury attaché sits across from me, nursing a scotch, his eyes constantly scanning the exits. He understands the architecture of the loophole better than anyone alive. Through his bureaucratic detachment, the attaché reconstructs the winter of 1994. The Mexican peso is in a catastrophic freefall. Capital flight is burning through reserves at a rate that threatens to ignite a sovereign default. Trading floors in Mexico City erupt in a visceral panic, brokers shouting over dead phones as the numbers on their glowing terminals turn blood red. The contagion is mathematical, and it is heading directly for the United States border. The executive branch drafts an emergency rescue package, a financial tourniquet requiring immediate legislative approval. But the newly elected Congress looks at the political optics of bailing out foreign debt and decisively blocks the authorization. The democratic process functions exactly as intended. The representatives of the voters say no. By every rule of constitutional law, the bailout is dead on arrival. The market braces for the inevitable shockwave of a shattered neighbor. But then, the attaché details an anomaly that rewrites the protocol of global finance. The panic does not materialize. We transition from the screaming trading pits of Mexico to a perfectly quiet, mahogany-paneled room deep inside the United States Treasury. Inside that soundproofed vacuum of power, an unelected official reviews a different set of protocols. If the legislature refuses to fund an international intervention, the executive branch does not accept defeat. They simply reroute the transaction through the shadow ledger. In 1995, they bypassed the furious Congress entirely, reaching straight into the Exchange Stabilization Fund. With a single signature on a classified authorization form, the Treasury unleashed a staggering $20 billion rescue package. Let that number sink in. $20 billion of sovereign leverage deployed across international borders without a single congressional vote. The attaché watches the wire transfer execute, witnessing the crisis instantly evaporate on the monitors. How do you move $20 billion off the books without triggering an audit? You utilize the ultimate legal loophole. The paper trail reveals the Treasury structured the intervention as a series of short-term loans entirely backed by the collateral of Mexican state oil revenues. It is a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a transaction engineered to exist completely outside the public appropriations process. The attaché takes another sip of his scotch, detailing the clinical precision of the maneuver. This was not a rogue operation. It was entirely legal under the 1934 mandate. The statute explicitly allows dealing in foreign exchange to stabilize the dollar. By defining the peso collapse as a threat to American currency, the Treasury unlocked a vault that effectively cuts voters out of the equation. I review the transaction logs from 1995, and the motive becomes chillingly clear. This maneuver established a terrifying precedent for the modern geopolitical landscape. The White House realized it possesses a secret credit card with effectively no spending limit. If the official budget is gridlocked by partisan warfare, the executive branch can simply finance its foreign policy off the balance sheet. As an investigator, I look for the shift in the modus operandi. The Mexican bailout was the exact moment the Stabilization Fund mutated from a defensive reserve into an active geopolitical weapon. The attaché knows that when you can move billions in the dark, you bypass the very friction that defines a republic. The power to economically stabilize is indistinguishable from the power to absolutely control. You are taught that the power of the purse belongs to the representatives you elect. You monitor inflation, you argue over tax rates, and you watch the public debates on the Senate floor. But the attaché in Geneva knows that is merely the public-facing theater. The real macroeconomic levers are pulled in quiet rooms where your opinion holds 0.0% weight. The dark beauty of the 1995 operation was its sheer velocity. By the time the public realized what had happened, the money was deployed, the crisis was averted, and the collateral was secured. There was no crime to prosecute, because the law itself was the alibi. The Treasury had successfully tested a financial override, proving they could unilaterally manipulate a sovereign economy in broad daylight. The attaché finally checks his watch and signals for the check. His paranoia is not rooted in the past, but in the precedent that was permanently set. Once a shadow system realizes it can bypass the legislature to save a foreign nation, it is only a matter of time before it turns that identical weapon inward. The blueprint for bypassing democracy was perfected, and the true domestic mutation was just waiting for the right panic. The blueprint for bypassing democracy was perfected in Mexico, but the true domestic mutation was just waiting for the right panic. I pull up the transaction logs from September 2008. The forensic accountant, sitting in the windowless, secure review room, stares at a glowing Bloomberg terminal. The data shows a catastrophic anomaly. The net asset value of the reserve primary fund is flashing red. To the trained eye, this is not just a market dip. It is a cardiac arrest of the global financial system. The fund has officially broken the buck, its value dropping below $1. For decades, investors treated money market funds as identical to cash, a completely risk-free harbor. But the ledger in front of me proves the harbor was mined, and the detonation has just triggered a run on the banks that threatens to liquidate the entire American economy. Here is the corpse in our investigation. The overnight lending markets are completely frozen. The central bank is paralyzed. But suddenly, a massive injection of synthetic liquidity appears out of nowhere, stopping the panic dead in its tracks. I follow the paper trail, expecting to find an emergency act of Congress. Instead, the forensic footprint leads directly back to the very same shadow ledger we discovered operating in the 1930s. How does a tool designed exclusively to stabilize the foreign exchange value of the United States dollar suddenly begin bailing out domestic mutual funds? The investigator looks at the timestamps on the server logs. While politicians were paralyzed by debate on the Capitol floor, an automated script in a secure server farm executed a systemic guarantee. The Treasury Secretary deployed a financial weapon with zero legislative authorization. I audit the balance sheet from that fateful week, tracing the flow of capital. The numbers are staggering. During the absolute peak of the 2008 financial crisis, the Treasury Secretary unilaterally authorized the use of $50 billion from the Exchange Stabilization Fund. But $50 billion is merely the seed money, the tactical vanguard deployed to halt a psychological panic before it consumed the physical economy. By pledging that $50 billion as an absolute loss buffer, the executive branch managed to backstop and guarantee the entire $3.2 trillion money market fund industry. Let that leverage ratio sink in. A single unelected official used a Depression-era slush fund to underwrite trillions of dollars of private market risk. The forensic accountant flags the transaction protocol. There were no public hearings. There was no debate over moral hazard. The money moved through the digital plumbing of the financial system faster than a news cycle could even report it. This was the ultimate domestic mutation. A fund explicitly legally restricted to managing foreign currency was suddenly acting as the ultimate guarantor of the domestic financial sector. The alibi provided to the public was that saving the money market was necessary to stabilize the dollar internationally. It is a brilliant piece of legal fiction. By stretching the definition of stabilization to its absolute breaking point, this action functionally transformed a foreign exchange tool into a shadow domestic central bank. The Treasury had effectively hijacked the role of the Federal Reserve, but without any of the statutory oversight. I cross-reference this maneuver with the original Gold Reserve Act of 1934. The discrepancy is glaring. Operating as a shadow central bank means stepping far outside its original 1934 mandate. The architecture designed to counter the gold standard was now absorbing toxic commercial paper in the digital age. The executive branch proved that the boundaries of their financial jurisdiction are entirely imaginary. As an investigator, I have to ask, if a law can be stretched this far without snapping, does the law even exist? The glowing terminal illuminates the uncomfortable truth. When the abyss opens up beneath the stock market, the bureaucratic rule book is thrown out the window. The Stabilization Fund is not just an account. It is a mechanism for overriding the democratic process whenever the elites deem the crisis too severe for your input. You are conditioned to believe that your government operates on a strict separation of powers. You think Congress controls the budget, the Treasury collects the taxes, and the Federal Reserve manages the money supply. But the server farm processing these systemic guarantees tells a completely different story. In the shadows of a crisis, those firewalls burn down instantly. The compartments merge into a single, unchecked financial monolith. This unprecedented bailout demonstrated that in moments of extreme panic, the line between fiscal policy and monetary policy completely erodes. Fiscal policy is supposed to be how your elected representatives spend your money. Monetary policy is how the central bank manages the currency. But the Stabilization Fund obliterates that distinction, allowing the Treasury to act as both spender and printer simultaneously. The paper trail confirms the ultimate thesis of our investigation. Laws are not rigid structures. They are simply reinterpreted on the fly to save the system. The precedent set in 2008 proved that the executive branch will not hesitate to use its shadow ledger to bail out domestic financial institutions. They will retroactively justify the intervention, confident that no court will dare unravel a multi-trillion-dollar rescue. The forensic accountant leans back from the terminal, rubbing his exhausted eyes. The transaction logs from 2008 are perfectly clear, yet they describe a ghost in the machine. A shadow entity stepped in, absorbed the lethal blow of a collapsing market, and vanished back into the balance sheet before anyone could demand an audit. We're looking at a system that relies on financial dark matter to survive. This domestic mutation fundamentally altered the DNA of American finance. The public was distracted by the highly publicized congressional bailouts, the theatrical votes that dominated the news networks. But the real salvation, the immediate liquidity that stopped the cardiac arrest, came from the Slush Fund. And if they could weaponize it to save $3.2 trillion in 2008, the next crisis would require an even more terrifying escalation. The next crisis arrived exactly 12 years later, demanding an escalation that dwarfed the bailout of 2008. Look at the split screen of our reality in the spring of 2020. On the left side of the frame, millions of Americans stand in miles-long queues at food banks and file for unemployment during the brutal economic lockdowns. On the right side of the frame, the air-conditioned silence of server farms in Secaucus, New Jersey. Here, high-frequency trading algorithms are quietly processing billions of dollars in corporate bond purchases. The disconnect is absolute. While the real economy bled out, the financial markets experienced an artificial, miraculous resurrection. My job as an investigator is to find the bridge between these two irreconcilable realities. Someone had to draw the complex flowchart connecting the suffering of Main Street to the salvation of Wall Street. The corporate debt market was collapsing, yet somehow the money printers fired up with pinpoint precision, bypassing the gridlocked legislature. I traced the transactions backward from the trading floors, looking for the beneficiary. The money trail does not lead to a standard government aid program or a voted-upon relief package. It leads to a network of financial ghosts. We are looking at the ultimate shell company architecture, built directly into the federal response. You watched the news coverage of the CARES Act, the massive 2020 stimulus package. Politicians argued endlessly over $1,200 checks for citizens. But buried deep within that legislation was a completely different mechanism. The bill allocated an astonishing $454 billion directly to our old friend, the Exchange Stabilization Fund. This was not money designated for hospitals, small businesses, or emergency unemployment benefits. This nearly $500 billion injection was specifically earmarked to backstop emergency lending facilities created by the Federal Reserve. The shadow ledger was being refilled with your tax dollars to serve as the ultimate insurance policy for the financial elite. Follow the money carefully here, because the legal maneuvering is brilliant and ruthless. The Federal Reserve has the power to print dollars, but they face a strict legal boundary. By law, the central bank is forbidden from taking on credit risk. They cannot simply buy garbage corporate bonds that might default, because taking a loss legally compromises the central bank. So, the architects of this bailout engineered a workaround. To execute this massive rescue, the government created special purpose vehicles. These are effectively shadow corporations, legally domiciled in the state of Delaware, set up specifically to absorb the toxic corporate debt that was poisoning the global financial system. These Delaware entities operate as a financial black box. They are off-balance sheet constructs, shielding the true nature of the transactions from public scrutiny. By creating these phantom corporations, the architects built a quarantine zone where bad debt could be hidden away, completely insulated from democratic oversight and congressional audits. But a shadow corporation still needs capital to operate. This is where the trap snaps shut. The Treasury took that $454 billion from the Stabilization Fund and injected it into the Delaware shadow corporations as equity. They used the Slush Fund as the sacrificial capital to absorb any potential losses from the toxic assets. Once that equity was in place, the legal barrier for the Federal Reserve vanished entirely. Because the Stabilization Fund was taking the risk of the first loss, the central bank was free to open the floodgates. They used that initial equity to leverage the money into over $4 trillion of immediate, untraceable market liquidity. $4 trillion. That is not a standard market intervention. That is the total financial annexation of the free market. For every single dollar the Treasury committed from the dark ledger, the Federal Reserve printed 10 more to buy up corporate bonds and commercial paper. They effectively nationalized the credit markets without taking ownership. The corporate executives whose bonds were purchased did not have to change their behavior. They continued to issue dividends and pay executive bonuses while their employees stood in those unemployment lines. The shadow ledger guaranteed their survival, socializing their catastrophic risks while ensuring their private profits remained fiercely protected. I look at the flow chart drawn on the glass board, and the architecture of the crime is flawless. The legislature was bypassed through the creation of corporate cutouts. The central bank's legal limits were circumvented using the Stabilization Fund as a shield. It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion and off-the-books shadow accounting. You are the unwitting underwriter of this entire structure. Every time your dollar loses purchasing power, you are paying the invisible tax for that $4 trillion injection. The Stabilization Fund had evolved from a foreign exchange tool into the ultimate domestic market maker. But this domestic control was only the foundation for their next move. The domestic market manipulation we uncovered was only the foundation for their next move. To truly hide a balance sheet of this magnitude, you cannot rely on domestic shell companies alone. You must take the operation international. I'm staring at a swift terminal interface, the glowing digital nervous system of global banking. The paper trail we have been following through Delaware suddenly vanishes, replaced by a dense wall of alphanumeric code. As an investigator, a dead end usually means you lost the money. But in the architecture of sovereign wealth, a sudden disappearance means the money has simply changed form. The strings of code flickering across this screen do not represent dollars, euros, or yen. They represent a phantom currency, a synthetic asset that exists nowhere in physical reality, yet moves billions across borders in milliseconds. We are tracking an invisible wire transfer bouncing through servers in Washington, routing through London, and terminating at the headquarters of the International Monetary Fund. Someone is moving massive amounts of liquidity off the books. I run the transaction data through the forensic filter, looking for a corresponding Treasury bond issuance or a congressional appropriation file. There is absolutely nothing. To understand the alibi being constructed here, we must decode the asset itself. The Exchange Stabilization Fund holds the United States quota of special drawing rights. This is not money in any traditional sense. It is a synthetic reserve asset created out of thin air by the International Monetary Fund. It functions as a closed network accounting unit, a privileged ledger available exclusively to central banks and sovereign treasuries. Think of a special drawing right as a high-stakes casino chip that can only be cashed in by the house. You and I cannot hold them, trade them, or buy groceries with them. But for the shadow treasury, these synthetic chips are the ultimate financial camouflage. When the fund receives its allocation of this phantom currency from the international authority, it essentially acquires a massive influx of purchasing power that bypasses every domestic democratic check. But a casino chip is completely useless until you convert it into cold, hard cash. This is where the paper trail reveals the true genius of the operation. The Treasury needs actual dollars to fund its geopolitical maneuvers, but going to the legislature means asking for permission. It means public hearings, budget debates, and ultimately, your scrutiny as a voter. So, the architects of this system designed a bypass mechanism to monetize these synthetic assets in the dark. By monetizing these synthetic assets through the Federal Reserve, the Treasury can generate billions of dollars in hard cash on demand. They deposit the phantom currency certificate with the central bank, and the central bank instantly credits the stabilization fund's account with freshly printed, highly liquid dollars. The money is essentially laundered into existence. Look at the sheer audacity of this transaction from an accounting perspective. They are generating massive liquidity without issuing a single new Treasury bond. Because there is no new debt being issued to the public, there is no need to ask Congress to raise the debt ceiling. They have engineered a silent printing press that operates entirely outside the constitutional framework of appropriations. It is taxation through inflation, executed via an international administrative loophole. We have just isolated the exact mechanism where sovereign accountability dies. This is the financial black box cracked wide open. If this scale of institutional evasion blows your mind as much as it does mine, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We are decrypting the true matrix of global power. And to not miss the final solution to this macroeconomic mystery, you need to be actively tracking this forensic investigation with us in the comments. Now, watch what happens to the transaction protocol after the dollars are credited to the shadow ledger. The public record remains completely blank. If a forensic auditor pulls the standard federal budget, this massive injection of liquidity does not register. The newly minted cash sits cleanly within the Exchange Stabilization Fund's siloed balance sheet. They have successfully disconnected the creation of money from the public burden of national debt reporting. What you are witnessing on this terminal is a meticulously designed closed-loop accounting trick. It is a self-contained financial ecosystem that effectively prints money off the books. Because the original asset was an international allocation of special drawing rights, and the monetization happens internally between the Treasury and the Fed, the entire operation is shielded entirely from public audit. It is a perfect, hermetically sealed transaction. From my perspective as an investigator, a system without an audit trail is not an oversight. It is an intentional feature. When billions can be manifested from synthetic international reserves, the traditional metrics we use to gauge the economy, tax revenues, deficits, official inflation targets, become nothing more than a carefully curated distraction. You are watching a puppet show while the real economy is engineered behind the encrypted walls of this windowless room. This untraceable fiat liquidity gives the executive branch a frightening degree of unilateral power. If they want to quietly bail out a foreign central bank, they have the untraceable cash to do it. If they need to manipulate the currency markets to favor a specific trade policy, the shadow ledger is fully funded and ready to deploy. They hold the ultimate trump card in the global financial system, completely insulated from voter backlash or congressional oversight. The digital wire transfer on my screen is finally cleared. The alphanumeric code dissolves, leaving no recognizable footprint in the domestic banking sector. The International Monetary Fund transaction is complete. The Federal Reserve has updated its internal classified ledger, and the shadow treasury is newly capitalized. The money simply materialized, ghost-like, slipping right through the cracks of our supposedly rigid financial laws. We have mapped the anatomy of how they hide the money and generate infinite liquidity off the grid. But accumulating this untraceable arsenal was never the end game. It was merely the preparation. When you build a financial weapon of this magnitude, operating in total darkness, it is only a matter of time before you point it at an enemy. And in the geopolitical theater of the 2020s, that weapon was about to be unleashed on a global scale. The arsenal of untraceable liquidity we uncovered was never destined to remain locked inside a Washington server farm. From my vantage point as a former Treasury attaché, you do not stockpile an infinite, unauditable reserve of fiat currency merely to balance spreadsheets. You build it to project power. When you control the plumbing of the global financial system, you possess a weapon far more devastating than any ballistic missile, capable of breaking a nation without firing a single shot. Look at the satellite feed dominating the briefing room monitor. You are watching a real-time heat map of global capital flight, bleeding red across the screen, as Russian oligarch yachts are seized in Mediterranean ports. But the real violence is invisible to the naked eye. We are zooming in on a digital ledger in Moscow, tracking a sovereign central bank account that is suddenly blinking offline. The anomaly here is the speed. A sovereign state was financially decapitated in an afternoon. To an intelligence officer tracking money flows, a nation's foreign exchange reserves are supposed to be untouchable. Yet on this terminal, a balance of $300 billion is rendered inaccessible with a single keystroke. How do you delete the accumulated wealth of a nuclear superpower in milliseconds? You activate the financial kill switch. And the trigger for that switch is wired directly into the shadow treasury we have been tracking. The architecture of this freeze requires immense off-the-books coordination. In the wake of the 2022 geopolitical crisis, the Treasury utilized its sweeping off-balance sheet powers to assist in freezing $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. This was not a standard sanction debated publicly by Congress. It was an executive action, executed through the deep plumbing of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, bypassing the slow machinery of democracy. You have to understand the sheer arrogance and genius of this maneuver. The money did not physically burn. It was simply exiled from reality. By leveraging the fund's absolute legal immunity, the Treasury could order clearinghouses and allied central banks to sever the connection. The target nation still holds the digital receipts, but the network refuses to acknowledge them. It is the financial equivalent of erasing a country from the map, leaving their economy gasping for dollars. This operation exposed the true nature of the account to the global intelligence community. The fund serves as the strategic vanguard for economic warfare, deploying capital to stabilize allied currencies while simultaneously choking off liquidity to adversarial nations. It plays both God and the devil. On one side of the ledger, it pumps untraceable synthetic cash to keep friendly regimes afloat. On the other, it weaponizes the dollar's reserve status to trigger catastrophic bank runs abroad. When I was stationed in Geneva, watching these quiet transactions glide through the system, the paranoia was palpable among foreign diplomats. They realized that holding U.S. Treasury bonds was no longer a safe haven investment. it was a hostage situation. If you cross the executive branch, the same dark liquidity pool that bailed out Wall Street in 2008 can be inverted to destroy your domestic currency. The dollar itself is weaponized, and the collateral damage is absolute. Watch the heat map pulse as the contagion spreads outward from Moscow. Without those $300 billion to defend their currency, inflation spikes, supply chains fracture, and the civilian population absorbs the shockwave. This is modern siege warfare, conducted entirely through alphanumeric codes and hidden sub-accounts. You do not need to bomb a city's power grid when you can simply order a centralized server in Washington to freeze the capital required to purchase foreign coal. We are looking at a terrifying paradigm shift in global power dynamics. This represents the evolution of the account from a defensive stabilization tool into an offensive weapon of mass economic destruction. A fund originally authorized in 1934 to merely protect the dollar from gold speculators has mutated into a global financial predator. It can unilaterally orchestrate the collapse of foreign economies without a single declaration of war passing across the desk of a lawmaker. As an investigator sifting through the wreckage of this economic strike, the chilling realization is the complete absence of a paper trail for the collateral damage. When you unleash a weapon of mass economic destruction, the blowback inevitably hits the global supply chain, driving up costs for you and me. Yet, because the operation is shielded within the unauditable walls of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, the domestic fallout is officially classified as an unavoidable market fluctuation. You might think freezing an adversary's account is a victory, but look closer at the precedent. By proving the government can confiscate sovereign wealth instantly, they triggered a silent panic among global superpowers. The world is now racing to de-dollarize, building alternative networks immune to Washington's kill switch. The Treasury has effectively placed a ticking time bomb under the foundation of our own currency. The monitors in this room are still flashing red, the algorithms ruthlessly hunting for any remaining assets tied to the sanctioned targets. The sheer operational silence of this digital slaughter is what keeps me awake at night. A few bureaucrats, operating under a Depression-era loophole, just rewrote the rules of global finance without leaving a single fingerprint on the public record. They have centralized the power to destroy nations into a black box that defies all congressional oversight. We have witnessed the ultimate expression of financial sovereignty, the ability to execute an entire nation's economy in the dark. But as the dust settles on this frozen central bank account, a much more dangerous question emerges from the shadows. If this obscure executive department possesses the unchecked authority to detonate a global financial crisis on command, who exactly is holding the detonator? The answer to that question reveals the darkest blind spot in our entire republic. The answer to who holds the detonator lies not in a fortified military bunker, but in the deafening silence of a completely empty, dimly lit hearing room in the United States Capitol. Dust motes dance in the pale light filtering through the windows. There is no one sitting in the oversight chairs. The gavels are untouched. We have handed the power to bankrupt nations to a phantom committee. As an investigator, my instincts scream when I see a vacuum where accountability should reside. We are conditioned to believe that every single dollar spent by the federal government is debated here, scrutinized by elected officials, and recorded in the public ledger. But the architecture of this shadow treasury bypasses the democratic process entirely. Who exactly is watching the watchers? The paper trail leads away from the empty oversight desks and directly into a high-rise office at midnight, far from the public eye. Inside, Two men in tailored suits are reviewing a confidential ledger over lukewarm coffee. They are not elected representatives. They are unelected technocrats, and they are managing what can only be described as an absolute accountability void. In a normal forensic audit, an unaccounted transaction of $10,000 triggers red flags, internal reviews, and potential federal subpoenas. Yet, the figures sliding across this mahogany table defy all financial gravity. We are staring at a structural anomaly that breaks the fundamental laws of governance. A blind spot meticulously designed to remain invisible to you and me. This off-the-books syndicate is not dealing with mere millions. Despite managing hundreds of billions of dollars in highly volatile assets, the fund operates entirely outside the boundaries of normal constitutional law. It bypasses the standard congressional appropriations process, the very mechanism designed by the founders to prevent financial tyranny and executive overreach. Analyze the sheer scale of the exposure. These unseen operators possess the unchecked power to backstop a $25 trillion domestic economy. They can shift the tectonic plates of global markets with a single authorization signature, yet they never have to justify their risk models to a single voting taxpayer or submit to a rigorous public budget hearing. The men reviewing these midnight ledgers hold the fate of your purchasing power in their hands, operating a parallel financial system shielded from the messy reality of democratic debate. When they leverage billions to bail out an offshore derivative crisis, your elected representatives find out about it the exact same way you do, by reading the morning financial news headlines. Every detective knows that if you want to hide a financial corpse, you must first blind the coroner. In the vast bureaucracy of the federal government, that coroner is the Government Accountability Office, the primary investigative arm of the legislature. Their strict mandate is to follow the money, audit the federal books, and expose systemic corruption wherever public funds are deployed. But follow the wire transfers of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and you hit a reinforced steel wall. By federal statute, the Government Accountability Office is legally restricted from auditing the international exchange stabilization operations of the account. The supreme auditors of the United States are strictly forbidden by law from looking inside the executive branch's most powerful vault. To an elite forensic accountant, receiving a mandate that explicitly outlaws the examination of a suspect's primary bank account is the ultimate insult. Yet, that is the exact statutory reality protecting this shadow ledger. The legal perimeter is constructed so flawlessly that not even a highly classified Congressional Intelligence Committee can pierce the veil of these midnight transactions. This engineered legal loophole creates a permanent blind spot at the very center of American geopolitical power. From this shielded vantage point, the executive branch can conduct secret macroeconomic policy without leaving a single trace of public evidence. They can fund shadow wars, manipulate global currency valuations, and bail out foreign allies in total darkness. We are not talking about a lack of clarity or a bureaucratic delay in reporting. We are talking about 0.0% transparency. This is an absolute blackout, hard-coded into the legal framework of the United States Treasury. The money moves, the markets react, the inflation hits your wallet, but the initial cause of the economic shock is permanently classified. The true horror of this investigation is not just that the money is missing from the public ledger. It is the realization that the system is functioning exactly as it was designed. They have built an unassailable fortress of financial autocracy right under our noses. And as the ink dries on that midnight ledger, this unaccountable machine is already preparing for its next evolution. The machine is already preparing for its next evolution. Our forensic accountant stares at the physical dollar bill under the macro lens, tracing the intricate green mountains and valleys of the ink. But the physical paper is an illusion, a dying artifact of a bygone era. The investigation has led us to the precipice of a monetary reset, where the tangible currency you hold is being quietly phased out forever. Under the glowing light of the terminal, the physical fibers of the dollar dissolve, replaced by the cold blue luminescence of a central bank digital currency token. The accountant closes the encrypted file. The audit of the past is over, but the terrifying reality of the future is just coming into focus. We are transitioning from physical bills that grant anonymity to programmable code that tracks every transaction. The investigator steps away from the desk, their role in this forensic reconstruction complete. But this is no longer a case file about federal accounting anomalies or distant Treasury officials. The focus shifts directly to you. The financial architecture we just decoded is the invisible cage being built around your personal economic sovereignty, utilizing a legal loophole drafted nearly a century ago. We began this investigation searching for a mathematical discrepancy in the 1934 Gold Reserve Act. We initially treated the Exchange Stabilization Fund as a dormant relic of the Great Depression, a dusty legal mechanism designed to manage foreign exchange rates. But the historical ledger revealed a completely different modus operandi, exposing a relentless consolidation of executive financial power. The evidence proved that this was never just an emergency tool. We tracked its fingerprints through the 1995 Mexican bailout, witnessed its domestic mutation during the 2008 money market panic, and mapped the complex shell company architecture it funded during the 2020 lockdowns. In every instance, the fund operated with absolute legal immunity, bypassing the voting public. We watched this off-the-books ledger morph from a defensive stabilization mechanism into an offensive weapon of mass economic destruction. It is an apparatus capable of freezing $300 billion of a sovereign nation's central bank reserves with a single keystroke. This is not democratic fiscal policy. It is financial warfare waged from the shadows. Now, as we approach the full implementation of programmable digital currencies, the stakes have escalated exponentially. The legacy architecture of the Stabilization Fund provides the exact legal shield required for a shadow rollout of a digital dollar. The infrastructure of the 1930s is being weaponized to deploy the dystopian surveillance tools of the 2020s without a single congressional vote. A central bank digital currency is not merely an electronic version of the money you already use. It is programmable fiat, capable of dictating where, when, and on what you are allowed to spend your own earnings. If the Treasury utilizes the Stabilization Fund to seed this network, they can circumvent the legislature entirely, trapping us in a closed-loop system. The ultimate danger is no longer just hidden bailouts for Wall Street institutions or the dilution of your purchasing power. The final threat is the centralization of absolute financial control within an entity that answers to no voters and leaves absolutely zero public paper trail. They have constructed an economic panopticon, and the Exchange Stabilization Fund is the black box powering the surveillance cameras. As an investigator reviewing the irrefutable evidence, my final verdict is absolute. Global financial sovereignty is an illusion. The democratic oversight you were taught in school is a carefully maintained fiction designed to pacify the public, while the true levers of macroeconomic control are pulled in windowless rooms. The system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as its original architects intended. We have discovered the most terrifying truth of the modern economy. The true sovereign power of this era is not the constitutional right to make laws or declare war. It is the unchecked unilateral authority to alter the value of your labor in the dark. Money is nothing more than the condensed time of your human life, and the shadow treasury has granted itself the permanent legal right to quietly steal your past. Every hour you work, every dollar you manage to save, exists at the mercy of an executive apparatus that views public accountability as a structural vulnerability. They have engineered a reality where inflation is a deliberate policy tool, and financial crises are simply opportunities to expand their unilateral mandate. The Slush Fund is the ultimate parasite, feeding endlessly on the host of the American middle class. If this forensic audit shattered your perception of how global finance actually operates, subscribe to this channel and leave your verdict in the comments. We must continue analyzing the evidence and building this public dossier because the financial matrix relies entirely on our collective ignorance. Hit the like button to signal that you are no longer blind to the invisible strings controlling the global market. The case file on the Exchange Stabilization Fund is now fully documented, but the investigation into our financial sovereignty is just beginning. The physical dollar in your pocket is a burning fuse, and the autocrats of the new digital economy are already rewriting the fundamental rules of ownership. Guard your assets, question the official ledger, and never stop demanding the receipts. The audit is complete.